All right, gentlemen, so we are going to look at the second section and the last section of Chapter 9. This is the last lecture for the course, and this is going to look at some of the challenges that exist regarding population and our study of demographics and our understanding of what our population trends mean going into the future. And much like everything I've tried to instill in you guys in this class, it's very important to remember that there are different ways of interpreting the data. Okay, the textbook and this lecture is going to present basically one way of interpreting the data, and then the movie that we watch on this stuff will present the other way of interpreting the data. And as educated, reasonable people, it's our job to look at the information and do our best to decide which interpretation we think is the best one with the information that we have. So here's a list of topics that we have here, and your objective questions, these conceptual questions that's important for you to know and to understand. Now, changing population trends. So here's the deal. The idea that there's two conflicting ways to interpret the data. One school of thought is that overpopulation is a problem, and all the data suggests that the population growth is slowing down, maybe even reversing, and that's a good thing. Okay. The other way to interpret the data is that overpopulation is not necessarily a problem. All the trends that we see show that population growth rates are declining, and we're seeing stagnant growth. And this is not a good thing, but this has the possibility to be a bad thing and even a disastrous thing in terms of nation and world economics, as well as other areas. So this is something that you guys are going to need to decide looking at both sets of data. We know that when there is a fast, high growth rate in an area, it can cause environmental challenges. Okay, it's probably overstating the case to say that this is an argument for population not growing. Lots of the reasons when we see this happen, we see it not because of birth rates in an area, but because of an influx of a large group of people at one time. So immigration, refugeeism, those types of things can put a real stress on not only the environment in that particular area, but the infrastructure as well. So the idea of rapidly growing populations using resources is true, and the use of those resources, when it happens all at once in one kind of fell swoop, that can overwhelm the infrastructure of the community, which will put stress on the environment of that community. But it's important that you guys recognize that that's a different thing than just saying as population grows slowly over time with births, it causes challenges. Infrastructure is a big part of this conversation, this equation. Infrastructure is the basic facilities of a country or region. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about roads and bridges, we're talking about transportation, sewage treatment, power plants, subways, schools, hospitals, that kind of stuff. And whenever an area, a community, a country builds those things, they build them for a certain number of people, and then they build them to be able to absorb some population growth. But when you have a whole bunch of people come into that area at the same time, very often the infrastructure can't support that. So what we see with rapidly growing populations is that resources end up being used. In fact, resources end up being used faster than the environment can renew them. And therefore this causes a need for resources to come from somewhere else, from outside of that local area, which causes the stressors and creates stressors to actually grow out from that local area. If we look throughout the world, okay, we see wood as a pretty important resource. We see local water as a pretty important resource. And we can actually envision and see times when standards of living decline when those resources get used up, when local water sources are polluted because of overpopulation. And what we see in developed world with overwhelming populations, things called suburban sprawl, where the population density just kind of goes farther and farther out. In developed worlds, we see polluted rivers, agricultural land burnt up and turned barren, not enough housing, even schools that cannot educate and take care of the number of students that want to attend them. Fuel wood and shortage of fuel wood is really important, especially when we're talking about the developing parts of the world. Poorest countries still use wood. Wood tends to be the main fuel source, and when you have a stable population, fallen trees and limbs will be used for fuel. But when populations grow rapidly, when you have a large influx of people very quickly, the dead wood cannot accommodate the need for fuel. And so people start going to the live wood and cutting it down. And once people start doing that, especially in a high population dense area, the amount of wood available gets smaller and smaller each year, to eventually you get to a point in time in that community, in that area, where there is no fuel wood available for use. And the shortage of fuel wood in these developing or these underdeveloped nations is unbelievably important, because the wood actually makes fire, which they can use to boil the water, which makes the water safe to consume, for cooking food, which makes the food safe to consume. If you take water directly from wells or rivers in those parts of the world, it's usually not safe, and food tends to be unsafe to eat because there's no refrigeration in those parts of the world unless you cook it. In order to sterilize these things and to cook the food to make it safe, you need fuel to make the fire. Without the fuel wood, you see an increase in disease, you see an increase in malnutrition. So you can see how overpopulation in terms of at least one natural resource can have these types of consequences. Unsafe water is huge. When we're in parts of the world, again, we're talking about the developing nations, the underdeveloped nations. When we're in parts of the world where they lack infrastructure, they don't have the ability to provide clean water. Water supply is usually a river or a stream. It's not just used for drinking, it's used for agriculture, it's used for washing, it's used for sewage disposal. So think if you live on a part of this river and upstream there's a village, and not only are they getting water from the river for their cooking, but they're bathing in the river, they're washing their clothes in the river, they're disposing of their sewage waste in that river. It's coming down the river to you where you want to use the water for yourself. And this creates real problems. Water supply is a breeding ground for organisms. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, they all come from, these are diseases that are transported through fecal matter into water systems. And when they become ingested, they have very bad side effects and cause people to be very sick. And many people throughout the world, throughout history, have died from these specific diseases. This is all, again, connected to people in a particular cultural setting that don't have the firewood that they would need to be able to cook or boil their water and sterilize it. And we also see cities. Cities are going to have pollution systems. They're going to have sewage treatment systems. But when we see we have cities doubling every 15 years, water systems cannot be expanded fast enough. But again, it's very important you guys understand this. When we say cities have pollutions doubling every 15 years, right now in the developed countries, this is not happening because of the rate that people are having babies. This is happening because of migration. Remember, we learned about migration in the last lecture. This is happening because large groups of people are moving into cities from other areas at the same time. Growing populations also have an impact on land. And in particular, we talk about arable land, which is farmland that can be used to grow crops. That's the definition of arable land, farmland that can be used to grow crops. But what happens when you have a growing population, land is either going to be used for housing or it's going to be used for agriculture, and a third use would be natural habitats. But people, as populations grow, people have to make trade-offs. And if I have this spot where I want to live, I'm going to live here, I'm going to build housing here, that's fine, but that land is now not going to be growing crops. And you can see a reduction in food, or food production anyway. Egypt, over the last several decades, has been an example of this happening. Egypt has a population of more than 69 million, and the farming, like many countries, provides the food. But the only place you can really farm in Egypt is the Nile River Valley, which is a very narrow strip of land that runs along the Nile. Obviously, most of the country in Egypt is desert, and less than 4% of Egypt's land is arable. But you got to think about this. You've got a pretty large population. And, do people want to live in the desert? No, people want to live in the city. They want to live along the river. They want to live close to where they work. The Nile River Valley is where the jobs are located and where most Egyptians live. So they continue to build housing on what is the only arable or the only farmland. It actually reduces the amount of land that Egypt has to do agriculture and produce food, which not only puts a stress on the country, but now creates a situation where more food has to be exported in. So, that's a challenge, again, in that local area. Urbanization, by definition, is an increase in the ratio or density of people living in urban areas rather than in rural areas. Okay, so as people move into an area, as that population increases, it's important to recognize that people are generally going to want to move into the city-type areas in a particular location. And so you have work in the cities, but you have the suburban areas where people live just around and outside of the cities where they live, and this creates a growing and a density of people, suburban sprawl. The suburbs get bigger and bigger. This creates traffic jams. Because there's an inadequate infrastructure. If a suburban town was put together and the roads and everything were created to be able to deal with 40,000 people, and all of a sudden in a couple of years you jump to 60,000 people, that's going to create challenges. We see a reduction of land for farms because that land gets broken up into development and houses are built there. Ranches and wildlife habitats are lost because of developments and houses. And housing within cities ends up becoming more costly because people say, well, I'll just live in the city. So there's your supply and demand, and there's more dense because you have to put more houses in, but there's not as much space, and there's not as much supply, which also increases the cost. Now, the world that we look at is a demographically diverse world. Countries are very different, and as they progress through the stages of demographic transition, as we talked about in the last lecture, it's not cut and dry. There aren't straightforward definitions for these things. Some countries have modern industries, but their incomes remain low. Okay. Interestingly enough, countries like China would be an example of this, where still a communist kind of economic paradigm exists, China has actually become more modern in its industries, but not as much of the wealth that's usually connected to that trickles down to the people. You have countries where they've achieved stable, educated populations with very little industrialization. So it is very diverse when we look at the landscape of all this in terms of the different countries. And then we have countries that kind of seem stuck in the second stage and aren't ever necessarily able to get out of that, unable to make enough educational economic gains to reduce birth rates and move into the third stage. And so the international community has begun to focus on the least developed countries, and it's debatable, and it is debated in society, in the academic world, what this focus means and whether it's important. And the least developed countries are countries that have been identified by the United Nations as showing the fewest signs of development in terms of income, human resources, and economic diversity. So now we're not just talking about developed and developing countries. Now we've got this category called least developed. And what the UN decides is when a country is put in that category, they can be given priority for foreign aid and development programs. This shows world population growth by region from 1750 all the way out to projected 2050. So how do we look at development and population growth? Less developed countries face the likelihood that continued population growth will prevent them from imitating the development of the world's economic leaders. And again, it's very important you guys remember, everything I'm saying here is interpretation based on the demographic data, okay? We look at countries like China, Thailand, India, and they actually are trying to find ways to reduce the fertility rates. So they're saying you need to have less kids so that we can move into the next stage where there is more wealth for everybody because there's more education, there's more working, and more jobs. And what they do is they advertise, they family plan, they give economic incentives. Some of these countries even will have legal punishment for families who have more than what the allotted number of children is. I'm not worried about this with the United Nations, so don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. We have seen worldwide fertility rates are dropping, and you should connect that back to the discussion we had about the replacement rate. The question is whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing. This text is going to present that as a good thing. When we see these rates dropping, generally what we see trending is they drop because those countries are now doing better, more people are working, they're more interested in making money. And so, again, some people are going to view this dropping in population as a good thing. We will watch a movie this week that will take a different view on that. Fertility rates declined in more developed and less developed regions. So right now what we're seeing, oddly enough, based on all the definitions we've had, but what we're seeing is developed and less developed regions having their populations and their fertility rates drop. And demographers predict that this trend will continue and the worldwide population growth will be slower this century than the last century. There are demographers out there that say it's not just going to be slower, but we're going to hit a point where it's going to start declining. So projections out to 2050, you look at the graph, as low as almost 8 billion to as high as 11 billion, with the middle being right around 9 billion.